our esteemed guest today. I'm very, very excited to have an actual expert to talk about something that we all experience. We've all. I can speak from personal experience. I take these things for granted that air moves through buildings of various temperatures, keeping buildings at constant temperatures, and I don't think a whole lot about it until something breaks. And so, but our guest today, Dr. William Bahnfleth, is the professor of architectural engineering at Penn State University and a fellow at the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and the International Society for Indoor Air Quality and Climate. His research interests cover a wide variety of indoor environmental control topics, including protection of building occupants from indoor bioaerosol releases, which is kind of accidental. Indoor bioaerosol releases are what we're talking about today. He is the author or co-author of more than 170 technical papers and articles in 14 books and chapters. So Professor Bahnfleth, welcome. He currently also serves, I should mention, as the chair of the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force. Do you pronounce ASHRAE in your ASHRAE?
Yes, it's pronounced ASHRAE, yes.
ASHRAE, okay. In ancient Middle Eastern studies, we talk about Asherah, the Canaanite goddess. So I didn't want to mispronounce it and accidentally be accused of idolatry. So
it's
welcome.
Most commonly mispronounced ashtray, I'll have to admit. So that's an improvement.
You have the floor, good sir.
Yeah, thank you. Very glad to be with all of you. And actually, ASHRAE is my main professional society. It's the main organization for professionals who work in the various parts of the air conditioning field. And what I'm going to show here is an introduction to this topic. Is a lot of information that I actually also present to professional technical audiences, but I think it can be understood on many levels. So this will give us an introduction to the background for why we do the things that we do with heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems. And I need to share my screen now, so one moment while I do that. And you should see my title slide now. So let's begin with where we are with respect to COVID-19. It's an interesting situation to be in if you're actually trying to do something about it. We're trying to stop a pandemic when there are a lot of things that we don't know very well. We don't know what the most important mode of transmission is, or a lot of the details about it. For example, we don't know how much virus an infector sheds. We don't know how much virus it takes to cause an infection with a high degree of probability. We don't know how viruses spread themselves around in the different sizes of droplets and particles that are produced that can carry it. But we do have a strong suspicion and some evidence that we can have what's called aerosol or airborne transmission under some circumstances, which means that particles that get into the air and move away from an infected person can be inhaled in sufficient quantities to cause an infection. And that's the whole reason why we talk about HVAC systems in regard to COVID-19 response. So we do know some things, and a lot of those are here on this slide. The SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 is quite small, maybe a mean size of about 120 nanometers, but that is a less important dimension than the size of the particles that it's carried in. They are larger and generally more filterable, and we also know, which will come up later, that it's very susceptible to disinfection with ultraviolet C-band light. The particles that contain it can be removed by not only really high efficiency filters like HEPA filters that you find in laboratories and hospitals, but also by the kinds of filters that you might put into a commercial building or a school or a church cost effectively. And ventilation can remove these particles as well. We don't have a lot of evidence of aerosol transmission in what I would call, in quotes, properly ventilated spaces. And that means ones that have enough outdoor air supply to meet current standards for outdoor air that should be used in the design of buildings. Where we have seen what looks like aerosol transmission indoors, there are usually several factors that might occur either individually or in combination. One is high occupant density. When you get a lot of people into a space, you reduce proximity and you have higher likelihood that more people are infected and producing infectious aerosols. Inadequate ventilation is another important factor in some of these super spreading events. It's, I think, quite clearly demonstrated in the Guangzhou, China restaurant super spreading event that has been discussed extensively, and also seems to be very likely in another high-profile case, the Skagit Valley, Washington choir practice incident, although there's less data to support that. And relatively long residence time along with these sorts of circumstances seems to be important. So walking through a space for a few seconds or a few minutes may not expose you to a very great risk, but when you, for example, spend an hour and a half at lunch, then that may give you enough time to be exposed. Air conditioning doesn't seem to play a big role in all of this. The air movement caused by air conditioners can help to spread infectious particles around if there are a lot of them, and that can contribute to infections. But air movement by itself within a space without some of these other factors hasn't been identified as a high risk factor. And what we really haven't seen is space-to-space transmission. So there's an infected person in one space, and infectious material goes through the air conditioning system, comes out somewhere else in the building, and there's enough of it to cause an infection. And we have seen that these viruses and viral particles can penetrate through an HVAC system, but as I just said, no evidence that there's transmission being caused by that. That's still under investigation. So the thing that those of us who've been working on HVAC guidance have been focusing on since the outset is what might be called the precautionary principle, that we should take reasonable measures to avoid threats that are serious and plausible. And we think there's enough evidence, and has been for months, of the possibility of aerosol transmission that we should do something about it, something reasonable to reduce that risk. So the things that we can do, we do have some existing knowledge of aerosol disease transmission that we can rely on. This goes back to diseases like influenza that we see every year, and measles that has serious outbreaks from time to time. We don't have a lot of good coronavirus experience except for what we happen to learn from the MERS and SARS-1 outbreaks, which is useful by analogy, but still we'd like to have proof that SARS-CoV-2 is behaving similarly. And we can apply the principles that we know will control air contaminants to remove aerosols that might be infectious, and embed that into an overall risk management process, which we'll talk about a little bit later. One of the things that I think is different about this pandemic and trying to come up with guidance is that new knowledge is emerging all the time. So we do have to, from time to time, adjust our view of things and change guidance if necessary. And all of this advice that I can give you at a general level is something that has to be adapted building by building. It's a starting point, but you really need to look at your facility in order to apply it effectively. So to move on to some of the specific important background, and infectious disease transmission modes are shown on this slide, and two are highlighted in this pandemic. One is airborne transmission, either by large droplets over short range, which is what CDC and WHO have focused on, the medical community in general based on their experience, and aerosol longer range transmission, which is where we can do something with HVAC. Intermediate surfaces are of some concern, but uncertain how important that is. You may have seen that WHO and CDC have both tempered their level of concern about touching surfaces that may be contaminated in recent times. But again, there's still reason for concern in doing something to disinfect surfaces that are commonly touched by many people, countertops, tabletops, chairs, pews, door handles, all those sorts of things. The others don't really come into play here: water and food, physical contact, or vector transmission, as far as we know. So what we're going to talk about with respect to HVAC systems mainly relates to limiting the risk of airborne transmission. So here we see over on the right the classic hierarchy of risk management. This comes, I believe, from either a NIOSH or EPA website. I'm forgetting which at the moment. But from top down, we see here the most effective ways to deal with any kind of a hazard we might find in a building. Eliminating sources is always the best thing to do. That's why testing is important. That's why taking yourself out of circulation if you think you might be sick are critical. But after that, if we may have a source of contaminants, some kind of hazard in a space, engineering controls are the next level, and that's really what we're talking about when we're discussing HVAC. Beyond that, rules and regulations or administrative controls and personal protective equipment can offer some additional protection, but they're generally perceived as not being as effective for a variety of reasons. Administrative controls, of course, the number one reason that they may not work is that people won't follow the guidance they've been given. I've seen, sure, we've all been in stores and seen people walking in the opposite direction from the arrows and going out through the wrong doors and not wearing their masks and all of those sorts of things. So while they can be very helpful if they're adhered to, they're risky because of that factor. So where do these infectious aerosols that we're concerned about come from? Mainly us, breathing, talking, singing, coughing, sneezing. Any activity that involves inhaling and exhaling will produce a spectrum of droplets of different sizes. You can see someone coughing there to produce some droplets for flow visualization on the right-hand side. And you can see just with the eye that they're a range of sizes, and you have big heavy ones that are falling near the person who's producing them, and others that seem to be moving off even at an upward trajectory. That's a critical thing here. Plumbing fixtures can also produce aerosols. You see a toilet being flushed there with the lid up. That's why we're advised to put lids down if we have them. There is some potential, we believe, for fecal oral transmission, which is using big words, nice way of saying that stuff that comes out of the toilet can wind up in your mouth and make you sick, which is less nice way of saying it, but that's the truth. And then there are medical procedures that can also produce aerosols. This figure on the right shows the kind of size range we're talking about for the initial size of these droplets that become particles. So this is water, but saliva and mucus contains other things, salts and proteins. So when they leave our bodies and get out into the air, because air is not saturated with moisture, they'll start to dry out and reduce in size. And the important thing to note here is that whatever the activity is, the spectrum is pretty similar, and some activities produce more than others. Singing isn't on here, but it is a very high producer of aerosol. And the other thing to notice is the size range. The peak of that distribution is around 10 micrometers. Although some would say that's a larger particle, they can stay airborne for quite a while. And if those dry to something a half or a third of their size, those are particles that could be in the air for even hours in some cases. When they get really small, they're essentially gaseous contaminants that could stay in the air indefinitely. So infected people shed viruses in these droplets, and we don't have a lot of good data on COVID-19 yet, but looking at influenza, there have been studies that have shown that 50% and even more than 50% of the viral load can be in particles that are smaller than 5 micrometers, which could certainly stay in the air for a long time and move far away from where the infected person is if the air currents carry them in that direction. So the large droplets that receive the early attention do tend to settle relatively quickly, but it's a bit of a myth that they're all going to fall out within 1 or 2 meters, depending on the velocity they have when they leave someone's mouth or how strong air currents are. They could move farther than that, but a lot of the risk of close contact does come from those largest droplets that are less likely to move far away. The smaller ones can move large distances. There's a lot of discussion about what the difference is between large and small. 5 micrometers is probably the wrong number. 60 micrometer initial diameter is more like what aerosol scientists are discussing as being a meaningful boundary between large and small, but it's actually a continuum, and under different conditions, even large droplets can move a long way, which we'll come back to. So I wanted to, at this point, give a brief introduction to HVAC systems. They come in all sorts of types, but probably the most common that's found in many larger buildings and schools and office buildings and a lot of retail facilities is much like what we see here. And the 2 boxes over on the right that say room in them, those represent spaces that are being conditioned by the system. And if you look at the top, you see that there's a supply of air coming down into each of those from the supply duct. So that would be in the summer cool, dry air that's going to maintain the temperature in the room, even though it's hot outside and we have heat sources. And the little boxes that would say terminal units, those are dampers or air valves that control how much air flows into the room. And they're controlled by the thermostat that has the little theta in it. So that's our temperature sensor that regulates how much capacity each room gets. So air comes from a central conditioning point. We call that an air handling unit that has a number of components in it. It goes through the room, picks up contaminants, picks up heat, perhaps picks up moisture, and then we go down to the return duct or return plenum. We'll just imagine for simplicity that it's a duct, and it goes back towards the air handling unit. And you'll notice there that past the fan, that's what that little circle is, with the line coming in, the line coming out, the air splits, and we see that some of it goes directly to the left, exhaust air discharge. This is air that we're throwing away essentially, along with all of the contaminants it contains. And then the rest of the air goes up on this little schematic and recirculates, and it mixes with outdoor air that's coming in for ventilation. So when we talk about bringing outdoor in for ventilation to dilute contaminants, what we're really talking about is replacing the air that we exhausted. So that's one of our main mechanisms for getting rid of contaminants. Now, if we go to the right of that mixing point at the upper left, we see a box that has some lines in it. That's a symbol for an air filter. And so in this air handling unit, we would find air filters, also the devices that heat and cool the air, and then a fan that would supply air to the spaces. And so that's the basic structure of these systems. Some systems don't recirculate any air, and that's something that's been discussed a lot. Should we allow air recirculation? And that's a complex point, because if we're recirculating air that has a lot of contaminants in it that we could have exhausted, maybe that sounds bad, but what if I have a high efficiency filter in my air handling unit? Now, if I'm recirculating air through it, I'm cleaning it there, I'm removing particles, and that air goes back to the space cleaner, and that may be better and less expensive than having a lot of outside air come in to dilute contaminants, which is a trade-off we'll get to here. Of course, air conditioning can also be this. You can have a building with no outside air supply, no central air conditioning, and your air conditioner is really your window and whatever air you can bring in through it. Maybe we put a window unit in the summer to cool it, but in a lot of places we would simply open windows in the summer, and that's also our source of ventilation in a lot of older buildings, and that's a concern because people don't generally open windows for the purpose of getting ventilation. They open them in response to what the temperature is like outside, and outdoor air brought in that way is less reliable. So we're talking about a huge range of systems, from very complex and central to very distributed. So the engineering controls that we have available are more outside air, ventilation, filtration, use fiber filters to remove particles from the air. Disinfection, we can, with some types of air cleaners, kill or inactivate things that are in the air. And to some extent, we may be concerned about air distribution, but only in certain circumstances, as I suggested before. So let's look at those things briefly. So ventilation dilutes, and by reducing the concentration of particles in the air, we lengthen the amount of time it would take to be exposed to enough of them to be infected. The figure over on the right comes from a study done in dormitories in China that very clearly shows that the lower the winter ventilation rate is, the higher the infection rates are, down to 1 liter per second per person, which resulted in 35% of the residents of that dormitory having 6 or more colds in the winter. That's a ventilation rate about comparable to what was in the restaurant in China that we were talking about earlier. A building that's ventilated according to current standards should have more like 7 to 10 liters per second per person. So if we've done a good job of designing the building and we've got 15 CFM, cubic feet per minute or so, we're in a pretty good place as far as infection risk from a lot of diseases. The problem with ventilation is it's very energy intensive. We have to condition the outside air down to the conditions indoors, which means maybe heating it up and humidifying it, or cooling it and dehumidifying it, and so it's a costly way to deal with contaminants. Ventilation also is part of pressurization strategies, not something that most buildings can implement, but it's used extensively in laboratories and healthcare facilities to keep air moving from cleaner to less clean spaces to, for example, protect immune-compromised patients, or to isolate someone who has an infectious disease. Filtration, well, I should say that ventilation is important because it removes all contaminants. It's the main thing we rely on to remove contaminants from inside a building. So it handles everything, not just infectious particles. But we should also have particle filtration in our systems because there are a lot of reasons to keep them away from ourselves and from the interior of our building. There are a lot of health effects from fine particulate matter, smaller than 10 micrometers, smaller than 2.5 micrometers maximum size, that have nothing to do with infectious disease. And there's an increasing trend of using better filters for that reason. So they can remove particles over a very wide range of sizes. How well they do it is a factor that affects the cost of the filter, and also how much power it takes to move air through it. We can see some standard filter curves that represent filters with different minimum efficiency reporting value, or MERV ratings, which is based on ASHRAE standard 52.2. And these are typical filter curve shapes. They tend to have a dip in the middle because there are two filter removal mechanisms at play here. For large particles, they tend to run into the fibers in the filter or be intercepted by them along a flow path. And so the larger the particle is, the more likely that's going to happen. That component decreases with size. But there's also Brownian motion, random motion of small particles, and the smaller the particles get, the more likely their random motion will carry them into a fiber. So there's an increasing trend to the left, and when you put those two components together, you get a low spot in the middle of the curve. Now, filters that are required by typical design standards today are no better than about MERV 8, the second filter up from the bottom there. And you can see there's a large range of particle sizes down in the aerosol size. We're worried about less than 2.5 micrometers, where we're maybe even below 10% efficiency for removing those particles. What's being recommended in guidance by ASHRAE and others is to go up to at least MERV 13, which gets us up to close to 50% efficiency for these really small 0.3 to 1 micrometer particles, and much better than that for the larger ones. For filters to work, the contaminants have to be in the air. They are in this case. We also have to get enough air through the filters to have an impact on the air cleanliness in the space. The filters over here next to this MERV chart are actually 2-inch MERV 13 filters that you could buy at a store. They look like other filters you might have seen, but the filter media has the properties it needs to have to remove particles at a higher efficiency than those filters. And we do know that particles are being produced by respiration in the size range we're concerned about. Here's some more modern respiratory droplet data you see on the left-hand side that again show that peak that's around 10 micrometers. And at the lower right, we see some data from sampling in a hospital in China that show that indeed we find viral RNA in some of these small particles that are 2.5 microns, 1 micron, even smaller. So filtration should be helpful to us in this case. And to bring this back together with ventilation, there have been a number of studies that have looked at other diseases to try to figure out how much we could reduce risk of infection by controlling aerosols with filters or with ventilation. This comes from one by Azimi and Stevens that looked mainly at influenza. And what we're seeing here for a 5,000 square foot building is the relative risk reduction on the vertical axis compared to the annual cost of doing it. And we have one curve that shows different efficiency MERV rated filters that shows that at about 13, we've lowered the relative risk by about 65%, and that beyond that, you can pay more for your filter if you want to, but it doesn't seem to have much more impact on the residual risk. And the colored curves show what it takes to get a certain level of risk reduction by using ventilation with outdoor air in different climates. And you can see that there is a climate effect, and that it's much more expensive at the levels that we'd like to get to than using filters. So if you can put in filters that are of sufficient efficiency, that may be a more cost-effective way to deal with risk than by greatly increasing outside air, which brings other problems with it. And to go back to the point of general air quality impacts of particulate matter, this figure shows what has been estimated to be the economic benefit in terms of morbidity and mortality cost per year per person when you go from one MERV filter level to another. So as I said, we're down in the 6 to 8 region right now at the left in the box, and we're talking about 13 to 14. And you can see there that depending on how bad your outside air is and how much particulate matter it has in it, we could be talking about a difference of hundreds of dollars per year per person. And you can see an example of how that splits up. It's mostly the cost of mortality, but that's a very big benefit. And the additional filter costs we have to pay off by doing that are pretty small. So this is, to some extent, a no regrets kind of option to upgrade in that way. And if you do a good job with ventilation and filtration, you've done most of what you would really need to do. But in some cases, air disinfection may be something that you would want to consider if you don't have adequate ventilation. If it's hard to get filters into your system, this can be very effective as well. So UVC light damages the DNA and RNA of microorganisms, and by doing enough damage to them, they can't reproduce, and so that's a form of disinfection. And we can make this kind of light with essentially the same technology as fluorescent lamps, low pressure mercury vapor lamps, and that's a technology that's been around for a long time. And we know that coronaviruses are pretty susceptible to 254 nanometer UVC. The Centers for Disease Control approved it for tuberculosis control. And with LEDs developing and a lot of research going on, it seems like we're about to see a real renaissance of optical radiation for disinfection, especially if far UV, which is safe for human exposure, is actually approved. One of the problems with 254 is that it causes the equivalent of a sunburn, both the skin and the eyes. So these pictures show some UV applications, so-called upper air, upper room in the upper left figure here. This is something that in congregate spaces where you have a lot of people, it can be very effective compared to ventilation and filtration, giving the equivalent some have measured of more than 10 air changes per hour of ventilation. As I said, you can't expose people to this light. So what we're doing, as you can see in the upper right, is creating a disinfection zone above the occupied zone. And air moves into that because people are warm and cause currents of air that go upward, and also the HVAC system or ceiling fans or other air movers will move air there, and it can be quite effective. It can also be put inside of air handling units to keep slime from growing on the cooling coils, which is a good thing in itself, but also if you size the system large enough, it can disinfect air as it comes by, and that may be a less expensive way to implement it than upper room, although it's less effective in terms of equivalent air changes. And also you've probably heard that some are using UV for surface disinfection as well. This is a fairly well accepted approach to disinfecting healthcare facilities, but it's also being used in other types of facilities now with the concern about the pandemic. The air distribution to me is not a problem unless we combine it with other things, or we really do some things that are ill-advised. Room air distribution moves infectious particles around, but if the concentration is really low, that may not be harmful. And there are some who say that well-mixed spaces are less risky than ones that are not well mixed. But if you have a strong source of air from an air conditioner or from a pedestal fan, as over here on the right-hand side, and that's near someone who's infected, then it has the potential to blow large droplets much larger distances away from them than otherwise would occur, and that could extend short-range large droplet transmission. So guidance from many coroners has recommended not using pedestal fans, personal fans, and other sorts of high-velocity air movers, and thinking about the patterns caused by some kinds of air conditioning systems that produce high velocities. So that's a really quick overview of the basic approaches. I want to mention to everyone the ASHRAE resources page, ashrae.org/COVID-19. There's over, I think, 400 pages of guidance there on different types of facilities. We don't specifically have one on places of worship, but the general principles are common to all of them. And there's some very good guidance there about reopening buildings that's applicable to all facilities. And also, you may see here, there's an email address you can write to with targeted questions, and hundreds of questions have been answered by the 150 members or so of the task force since we started taking them back in March. So to summarize, the main infection risk for COVID-19 is proximity, and so distancing and PPE are important. We just have to stick with that. Ambient exposures indoors can, under some circumstances, rise to the point where airborne or aerosol infection is possible, so we want to use our HVAC systems and other measures to prevent that from happening. In terms of priorities, getting an outside air supply into spaces, or at least a reasonable one, is the first thing, because we need that for a number of reasons. Good particle filtration is the second thing that would be recommended. Upgrade as much as you can in central systems. Consider using portable filters if that's not really easily done. And air cleaners, in some cases, may be a good further addition, but I wouldn't say an absolute necessity. We can get the job done with ventilation and filtration if we need to. And so with that, I can end my prepared remarks here and take as many questions as we have time for.
That's good, because we've got a bunch.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. That was really informative, and you actually answered several of the questions that had come in already. But I do have a few. The one that I want to start with, because I think it might be a fairly easy one to do, and it leads to several others, is, are all furnaces able to push air through MERV 13 filters?
Possibly not. That's something that it's a good idea to have a technician evaluate it. It really depends on the power that the fan has and the characteristics of the fan. So that's something that should be looked at. And it's probably good not to gamble on it, because if you really put in a filter that was too high in resistance for your fan, you could burn out the motor or not have enough airflow to condition the space properly. But I should say that filters come in a wide range of pressure drops. So that in general, the higher the MERV rating, the higher the pressure drop will be. There are some ways to get around that. There are electrostatically charged filters that, at least when the charge is on them, will get up to that level. But the concern about them is that the basic filter, when it doesn't have charge on it, is not very good. So that's one possibility, but maybe not the best. Putting in HEPA filter units is a really reliable way to supplement whatever you're able to do in a furnace.
So that leads to a question that the specific request, and I second it, is to please answer this like we're clergy who know nothing about HVAC rather than HVAC engineers.
Sure.
Which you've done an excellent job of, by the way. What numbers should we be looking for on our HVAC units in terms of air exchange rates, fan speeds, fan loads, that kind of thing? Where are they generally located, and what minimum numbers should we be looking for?
Well, there are a lot of different types of HVAC systems. So the amount of supply air that they provide to a space could vary widely. I think the first thing that we're concerned about would be how much outside air are you bringing in. Some systems don't bring in any, right? Our home air conditioner typically only recirculates air inside the house. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but our split systems, that unit that sits outside doesn't bring in any outside air, and we're relying on our windows. There are standards for determining how much outdoor air should be brought in. If you were to look at something like an office building or a school, that kind of density in a room, it might wind up being 1 to 2 air changes per hour of outdoor air, which means a flow rate equal to an amount that would equal the volume of the space served, or the area of the building served, twice an hour. But that's not actually how those ventilation numbers are determined. We look at what is the floor area, and we need to have so much airflow per unit of floor area and so much per person for a different type of occupancy, but that gets turned into air changes. Now, in terms of controlling a contaminant like SARS-CoV-2, we actually should think about air changes, because the amount of time it takes to remove contaminant from a space is going to go down as the air changes rate goes up. And suppose someone was in a space and they were infected and they put a certain amount of infectious aerosol into the air. If they left, to get rid of 95% of it, if you had a well-mixed room, it would take about 3 air changes. So that the time to get 3 air changes is something that a lot of, let's say, schools, universities are looking at as turnover time for a classroom. If you have one air change per hour, it takes 3 hours to get 3 air changes of outside air. So that's a long time. But remember that if we're recirculating air through filters and we can calculate the equivalent air changes there, that counts too. So that's one of the reasons that having recirculation with good filters can help a lot, because that could give you the same level of clearance of a space in 20 or 30 minutes that it would take hours to get if you were only ventilating with outside air. Add one more thing to it. A lot of systems that you would find in schools or office buildings, which are comparable to a lot of, say, administrative spaces or class spaces in religious facilities, might have 6 air changes per hour of supply air, which means we've got maybe 1 of outside air coming in, but 5 that are recirculated. So those 2 airflows are usually much different. And the fact that they're different, of course, is one reason you can increase the outside air. So if you have 5 air changes of supply that your system can provide, but you're only bringing in 1 now, you should be able, by adjusting the controls on the system, to increase the amount of outside air that comes in. But how much, that's a question no one has really answered in a quantitative way. We do know that if you bring in too much outside air when the conditions are too extreme outside, you're not going to be able to cool it and dehumidify it in the summer, or to heat it in the winter. We've tended to look more at filters as an answer than really extreme amounts of outside air for that reason, and because of the energy cost.
Which leads then to a question. We know that in recent years, building owners have tried to improve energy efficiency by tightening up the air infiltration, caulking, weather stripping, going to more efficient windows, etc. Since many church buildings, especially smaller ones, are built to residential type standards without a specific fresh air intake, is there a reliable way to know how many air changes per hour a building has?
You mean if it has a forced air system, or it has a mechanical ventilation supply from outside?
I would think so, yeah. It's not specific to the question, but.
Yeah, the amount of outdoor air that's being brought in by the system can be measured easily enough with instruments that would measure the airflow through a duct or through an outdoor air intake. How much leakage you've got that would contribute to that is hard to determine unless you do something called a tracer gas test, which is something most would probably not want or need to do. But I think the thing I'd say is that leakage is just additional outside air. So if you know you've got enough coming in from your mechanical ventilation system in the first place, and you're getting some more from leakage through windows, that's not necessarily a bad thing, although it's kind of an uncontrolled heating and cooling load.
Yes. Yes. So we have several questions about the UV lighting in terms of installing it, safe UV lighting for LEDs in particular, and what's the recommended duration and lumen level for LED lamps?
Oh, I don't know. Don't think of it in lumens. We tend to think of it in how much energy is delivered, right? There's a certain dose that will inactivate a microorganism. So what we really discuss in sizing those systems is what is the average fluence or irradiance, depending on whether it's in a volume or on a surface. So that would have units of, say, microwatts per centimeter squared, or typical units. It's a radiation intensity at a point, and we have dose response expressions for microorganisms. It's exponential, and we measure in the laboratory the susceptibility of different microorganisms, and then we can figure out with a certain irradiance or fluence how long would you have to expose a population of those microorganisms to, say, reduce the population by 90% or 99% or whatever the target is. So you can can do that calculation. Typically, the fluence levels in duct systems could be 1,000 to several thousand microwatts per square centimeter. The CDC's tuberculosis guidelines recommend in that disinfection zone 30 to 50 microwatts per square centimeter. And you could see where the fixtures were distributed around that space in the example. There wasn't a lot of them, but that's an expensive way to do it. That could be $3 to $4 a square foot for equipment plus installation, and you could probably do a central air system for maybe $1 a square foot. So there's some significant cost differences between different types. And just about everything is still mercury vapor lamp. LEDs are coming, but they haven't really gotten to the power and cost levels yet to completely knock mercury vapor lamps out of the box, but they're certainly going to do it just like they've done that with vision lamps.
Great. All right, I'm going to see if I can combine some more questions here because they're on the same themes but have specific pieces. So we've got questions about HEPA systems, and I know you had talked about the MERV 13, which is below a HEPA filter. So yes. Can you describe maybe the difference between HEPA and MERV just in brief lay people's terms?
They're both ratings. HEPA stands for high efficiency particulate air filter. And those are tested by a test standard that uses 0.3 micrometer particles, and the basic HEPA filter has to remove 99.97% of those to be called a HEPA filter. So it's just a test at one size. It doesn't mean that it doesn't capture smaller particles. That's just the way that test was structured in the beginning. HEPA filters were used in the nuclear industry actually early on. There's a lot of concern about radioactive particles in nuclear reactors. The MERV rating uses 12 different particle sizes between 0.3 micrometers and 10 micrometers. And there are 3 different size ranges that are rated: 0.3 to 1, 1 to 3, and 3 to 10. And the lowest efficiency for any tested particle size on repeated loadings in those ranges determines the MERV rating. So for a MERV 13, they have to remove at least 50% of particles between 0.3 and 1 micrometer. And I think it's 85% between 1 and 3, and 90% from 3 to 10. So it's quite a different test. But the filters are qualitatively not that different. Just the HEPA filters will be thicker and denser in order to capture more particles. They could all be made out of glass fibers, for example.
Okay. So, so the HEPA filters could potentially slow down airflow more than a MERV filter just because of the thickness of them, or?
Yes, they're high pressure drop, and it's kind of unimaginable that you could take an ordinary air conditioning system in a church or an office or a school and put a HEPA filter in the first place, because it probably wouldn't fit and you don't have the right kind of frame to put it in, but also it could have a would have a very significantly higher pressure drop than what the system had been designed for, and I'm sure it would give the fan trouble.
And we have a number of questions that sound like the best recommendation is probably to consult an HVAC engineer in your specific community to gauge your system. So one of the questions was, how do you find a reliable HVAC engineer who can really help you think this through for your own particular space?
Yeah, well, certainly there might be consulting firms that do HVAC design, or commissioning would be another place to look, because commissioning agents' job is to go in and assess systems and make sure that they're performing the way that they were designed to perform. You certainly want probably registered engineer to do that, although there are contractors who do commissioning and the technicians who do maintenance who know what they're talking about, but a professional engineer would be a good source, and I would look for the same ones who design and commission systems.
Okay, we have some questions about the ionization units, and particularly in comparison to UV filters for actual systems and for MERV and HEPA filters.
Yeah, that's a very controversial topic. Those ionizers and dry hydrogen peroxide and photocatalytic oxidation, several different types that either put ions or reactive oxygen species into the air have been around for a while. And the feeling, at least in the academic community that I come from, is that the evidence for their performance is not as clear or reliable as what we know about UV, and certainly not about filters. I mean, we know quite well that filters will take particles out of the air. Some ionizers have been tested for their ability to reduce particulate concentrations in the air, and they do that. They put charges on particles and they'll stick together and perhaps settle out more rapidly because of that, or putting a charge on them may make them stick to a filter. Remember, I was talking about electrostatically charged filters. So you can put a charge on a particle and make it stick to a filter too. The less well, I would say, understood aspect of it is how you design a system to be as effective as you like it to be for a particular space. There are lots of test reports that have been published by manufacturers, and some of them look pretty good. Some of them are not at conditions that seem to reflect what the application would be. So ASHRAE has shied away from endorsing them, but there's enough evidence that they can work that with perhaps professional eyes on the operating characteristics that are claimed, they could be useful. That's, from my point of view, where that is. It's an area where we need more research, because I do think there's something there. I wish that we had a better worked out way of designing those systems that any engineer could understand, rather than asking the manufacturer what they should use.
Great. So again, I'm trying to combine some questions here. So my apologies to all of you who have asked specific questions. We may not have time to get to all of them, but I'm going to do my best to get at least a broad answer from Bill. Portable HEPA filters placed near a speaker and the distance between a speaker and the congregation in terms of minimizing risk of spread.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, that's one where airflow direction is of some importance. You know, if you've got, say, a speaker who's on a lectern or the altar, if the air is moving away from the congregation, that would be a good thing. As far as a distance from a filter, that's hard to say. The main thing we think about with portable filters is clean air delivery rate air changes. How much clean air are we getting out of it? But if you had a filter so the discharge of it was tending to blow air away from people who might be exposed by the speaker, that might be a good way to do it. But then you're kind of assuming that that's the person who's going to be the one creating risk, and not somebody sitting in the first pew who is now exposing them. That's a real tough one, because you don't know where the infected person is going to be. So you need to think in terms of solutions that will work no matter where they are.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
The choir might be an exception, but I still think it's been a while before we have large groups singing in church, unfortunately. My wife is actually a church musician in local Methodist churches, so we talk about this all the time. And they're right next door to the local UCC here in State College, so we know them.
Yes, and we actually had our webinar on singing last week, which, for those of you who didn't get to see it, is available on the UCC YouTube channel under our very own playlist. Okay, so in our last couple of minutes, there are a couple of questions about buildings that don't have air handling systems, that just have fans and windows that open, and also about opening windows in winter where it's just a hot air or a forced hot air system of furnace.
Yeah, well, you don't have a lot of good options there besides perhaps putting exhaust fans in some windows to try to get up to what seems like a reasonable outside air flow rate. That's actually something they're doing in the building I work at Penn State. It's over 100 years old and has steam radiators and no outside airflow in some of the rooms. So they've put exhaust fans in the windows. Why exhaust fans? Because they're exhausting room from the space and they're not blowing big cold jets in the winter into the space. So you have a fan or fans in a space and you could crack some windows and get a little bit of air and you have at least a chance of your heating system keeping up with it.
Mm-hmm. And there's one case study here, and I apologize, there's a couple of them here that sound really interesting, but this is the one that I think may be helpful. In our sanctuary, the return air is through two places at the back of the space with supply air up from the floor along both sides of the space. Should we be looking at modifying the return air system so that people in the back aren't exposed to all of the air flowing to the back of the room?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It depends in part on how well the air is mixed. Obviously, it is going to tend to move to the back of the room. Possibly that would be something that would be valuable, but I don't normally think about the location of the returns as being too critical of a factor. And again, it goes to the question of, well, where do you think the infected person is, and where do you think the susceptible people are? That might be very helpful in one case and not make much difference in another. And on the other hand, it's a good way to get people to sit up front, which is a problem we've been trying to solve in churches for a long time, haven't we?
There you go. There you go. All right, so we are at 1:04, but I think if everybody's willing to hang for 2 more minutes, we can answer 2 more questions that have popped up in a number of places. The first is, your chart showed sneezing, coughing, and talking. Where do singing and shouting fit into that chart? So would singing be equivalent to coughing, between coughing and sneezing, that kind of thing?
I'm remembering from some of the research I've heard of that singing might be 3 times talking in terms of that. So you'd have to see where that would put you on that slide, but it's a lot more than just talking. Mm-hmm. So perhaps up in the same range as periodically coughing or sneezing.
Mm-hmm. That tracks with what our expert said last week. And then the last one, because we were actually talking about this last week as well, and I think we actually deferred to your expertise, is if we were to decide to hold small group, masked, socially distant indoor worship, we'd need more than one service. Would it be beneficial to have a break of 30 to 60 minutes between them rather than holding them back to back?
Yes, based on what I was saying before, is if you happen to have someone who was infected, then if you allow some time to clear the air, you have a chance of getting rid of any residual contamination. We don't know exactly how infectious COVID-19 is, but that's certainly something that's being done in similar situations.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I do apologize again to those of you whose questions we didn't answer directly. Hopefully you got enough information out of what Bill said to help you start making some decisions. We do encourage you to watch this again. Maybe take some notes, maybe show it to your boards and whatnot as you're talking about the different things that you need to do. And before we go, I'm going to pop up some links to different things, including our playlist for you. And any final words of wisdom, and then I'm going to turn it over to Zach.
Words of wisdom. Well, we all have to be careful, but don't let this get you down too much. I think you can be safe inside of a building if you do the right things, and if you practice distancing and wearing masks. So we all have to be confident that we're going to come out of this all right.
And before I turn it over to Zach, OCWM, our church's wider mission, is how these webinars are being provided. So if your church it has not contributed to OCWM yet, and you are finding these beneficial, please make an effort to have your church make a contribution or do so yourself personally. You can do so at the UCC website. And in particular, we are grateful to the Environmental Justice Group and to Brooks Burnt and his group for all that they do. Zach.
I will just say that we have planned to do 2 more webinars in this series. Next week, we'll be joined by the Reverend Bill Worley, who was in addition to being an Army chaplain and pastor, is the current conference minister of the Penn Southeast Conference, and will be talking to us about pastoral care in times of crisis, in times of trauma, because this is not something that we were all prepped for. And so somebody who is both literally and figuratively has been in the trenches, it should be a very informative session. And then the week after that, we're taking a step back, and we've been talking about all the things we can't do and all the reasons why we can't do it. So we want to spend just one session talking about the things that we can do, the things that we are doing, highlighting some of the things that you've been doing, as well as the things that we've been seeing, and brainstorming some of these amazing new ideas for taking this time as a moment to transform what we do, why we do, and how we do it. And so that will be a much more, I think, if I can say, a light session. We'll be talking less about things that kill you and more about things that bring you life. So you can find the links to, Ruth just sent those into the chat. For the email sign-up list, we'll send you links from when this video and future ones will be available. You can just go on YouTube and look up United Church of Christ. We are on the official page. And yes, there's a link to that playlist on there. And so I just want to end with a comment that Sharon Cook wrote into the chat. She said, and I want to echo this sentiment: thank you so much, Bill. You know so much about things I've never heard of, and I am grateful for your time. And if we could just fill our lives with people who know so much about things we've never heard of and ask them questions about those things, how much richer would all of our lives be? So thank you so much for taking your time, Bill. And
it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes,
absolutely.
And I would echo that. And for those of you who have been with us for all this time, please just say a prayer that I get an apartment. I've got applications in, and moving in the middle of a pandemic is not easy, but I start my new church on Saturday. So that's a really terrific thing. And thank you for participating. And thank you, Bill. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Brooks. I think we're all set.
All right.
So
God
we
be
will
with you all.
see you all next week.